Welcome back. Welcome back to the afternoon session. I'm delighted to welcome Karen Di Franco as our first speaker this afternoon. Karen is a curator and PhD researcher with Tate Britain and Reading. She's also one of the co-curators of the exhibition at Chelsea Space, and she and I have worked on a number of projects together, and here she's going to be talking about Carolee Schneemann.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for everyone involved in organising today. It's been really interesting so far, and so hopefully it will stay that way. My name is Karen Di Franco. I'm going to present a short presentation on Carolee Schneemann.
You'll need the microphone.
Can you not hear me? Sorry, I am speaking into it. Is that better? Sorry, can I get some technical assistance? Is that better? Can you hear me at the back? Okay, thanks. So I'm going to be talking about Carolee Schneemann's Parts of a Body House as score, document and publication. So I've just included an installation shot of the text, which we had reset by a designer into a poster that spans the length of the display space at Chelsea Space. I just put this in as a kind of idea of my particular relationship to this text. So this is actually the 6th time it's been reset in its generation. So the text, Parts of a Body House, 1957 to 68 by Carolee Schneemann, exists across a set of multiple iterations, publications and durations. Moving through a series of registers from instruction to description to action, the text speculates on the possibility of an imagined environment and the interactions that might occur within it. Published within Schneemann's first artist book, the eponymously titled Parts of a Body House book, made in 1972, the text operates as an embodied presence on the page, with reading and performance of reading as outcomes of the reader's engagement, as a tactile experience with the anatomy of Schneemann's writing. Schneemann's commitment to writing as a combined element within her performance work emerges from a period of intense experimentation in the mid-1960s and is as a need as much as a pleasure, to stake a claim as much to declare a presence. Within the multiple elements that make up the book, reportage spills into confessional, biographical accountancy, and performance instructions are transformed into intimate encounters that explore theoretical ideas around duration, objective synthesis and indeterminacy. By examining aspects of this textual immediacy, as I like to call it, through layout, typography and authorial and editorial proximity, this presentation will consider the importance of publishing in her work. So it's going to focus on this text specifically and the first artist book, Parts of a Body House book, that was made with the Fluxus-affiliated press Beaugest in Devon in 1972. Until now, there's been scant sort of reference to this beyond sort of bibliographic data in our historical art library history accounts of artist publishing in the UK. So from this position of sort of, I hate to use the word obscurity, but in some cases it's kind of correct, exploring the context of this book's production as well as the book itself has become essential, as historical documentation of the period of time that Schneemann was here in the UK is quite limited. There's mainly only photographic documentation available of the performances that took place while she was here. So Parts of a Body House book describes a mode of assembling that Schneemann would replicate in her second and her third artist books. The second one is called Cézanne, She Was a Great Painter, that was published in 1974, and then in 1979, More Than Meat Joy. Through multiple modes of representation, the book documents many ephemeral aspects of Schneemann's work within filmmaking, performance and writing. It incorporates material documenting her previous experiments in performance and filmmaking with newly produced work, re-edited and represented items, alongside original artist multiples. Using the book as a means to rehearse, prototype and converse ideas is not arbitrary. Schneemann activates the role of publishing through this and in other works, from conception to distribution, as a conceptual mode within her artistic practice. Schneemann demonstrates a collaged approach to publishing in this book and in other document works, a technique that is mirrored in her film and performance work. Indeed, this fragmentary, layered and often revisited approach to working is grounded in her practice as an intermediate artist. Published by the lesser known in the art world at the time, yet significant now, Fluxus affiliated press Beau Geste, also sort of brings forward this idea of the importance of Fluxus publishing in the UK and their work in general over a very, again, fairly short period, about 6 years in the 70s. They were also organisers of Fluxu, which was the kind of UK tour of Fluxus works in the early 1970s. Through their organisation of the press in the farmhouse in Langford Court in Clumpton, Devon, their production of work is situated not just within the studio but within the home and made in collaboration with others. So this is a dialogue between other works as well as other practitioners who happen to be around at the time. So I see this book as a valuable contribution to the history of artist books, not just as a sort of highly personal publication made by Schneemann, who as a woman practitioner is commonly known more for her performances, but it also acts as a confirmation that artist books made by women at this time do actually exist, although they are generally overlooked for other works that are more privileged. So understanding this contribution has sort of a kind of dual practice for me in terms of informing art historical understandings of Schneemann, but also understanding around artist publishing. So it's not, I think also I should just raise a question. In 2017, she had a retrospective at MoMA, and I think it's interesting that for the first time this publication was actually displayed within that larger exhibition. So this sort of raises and confirms points that I'm sort of investigating through my PhD around the status of this object as an artwork, as well as an archive object, and as well as a library item. So Schneemann had established her writing through several publishing routes prior to her relocation in the UK, with material specifically to her film work, as in Meet Joy notes as prologue in the publication Something, which you see here, which is edited by David Antin, and her contribution was from number 2, 1965. She also wrote about her film Snows in the Art and Technology newsletter in 1967, and she also made a contribution to the anthology publication Notations, which was edited by John Cage and Alison Knowles in 1969. Other writings included a text called Hormone Circling in the small print publication called Matter, which was edited by Robert Kelly in 1963, and Notations 1958 to 1966 in the poetry and experimental writing journal called Caterpillar. So this was in edition 8 and 9. So Caterpillar is a very important publication to Schneemann because it's also the site for the first publication of the text Parts of a Body House, which would feature in issue 3/4, which was published in April to July 1968. So Schneemann established a very strong working relationship with its editor, Clayton Eshelman, who was a poet and translator. So between sort of 68 and 69, she contributed to 3 different editions of Caterpillar. So this is pre her journey to the UK, in a sense. So this is work that's coming out of New York. So she contributed the cover, which you see here, and a sequence of stills from her film Fuses to this edition number 2. And then she also included another cover, which I'll show in a second. So this establishes, I guess, her kind of relationship to the avant-garde poetry and experimental writing network through such writers as Jerome Rothenberg and Antin, who we've already mentioned, who were also friends and practitioners as well. So this, there's a kind of element of innovation, I think, in terms of her relationship to Clayton Eshelman, because their correspondence relationship extends into her time in Paris and then in London, once she relocates to London in 1970. So this particular type of written correspondence that they have is very particular to the fact that she's away from New York. And this establishes a particular type of writing for her, which, as I'll show later, has a kind of direct correspondence to the work that she's making. So this is just Clayton Eshelman's notes on Carolee Schneemann's Fuses. And this is the front and back cover of Caterpillar 7. So as a typeset text, Parts of a Body House exists across 5 iterations. It was first published in the journal Caterpillar, and this particular layout retains the sectional layout that Schneemann outlines in her TypeScript with subheadings. So as you can see, it has a very particular layout. So I'm just going to give a kind of overview of this text because I can't actually read it all out because it would take too long. But you're welcome to go and read it in the exhibition. So, Parts of a Body House by Carolee Schneemann is a container for a text. It's a conflation of a score as instruction in preparation and the observed documentation of a performance taking place within a prepared and described environment. Moving through a series of registers from instruction to description to action, it speculates on the possibility of an imagined environment and the interactions that might occur within it. So there she's next to image by Leon Golub. I don't know quite how you pronounce his name, but that's not her work. So here you can see the original TypeScript, so you can see how it is kind of mirrored across the reproduction in Caterpillar. I just wanted to add that because the next slide is its second reproduction. So it's republished in Fantastic Architecture, which was published by Something Else Press in 1969. And this is a very different translation of this work, although it remains in sections with type headings. The text is overlaid over an image of Schneemann naked and crouching, which is actually extracted from a flyer for a radical film programme, of which there's another contested history which I can't go into right now. But there's something very political about, I think, the relationship between text and image in this instance. The actual layout of the publication means that there are several interventions anyway by the editors. But not only that, they actually reordered the text, so the ending of the text is significantly different to its original order. And I'll get to that again slightly later. So as you can see, Hair and Fingers Room ends up being the ending as opposed to the Gorilla Gut, which completely changes the emphasis of the text completely. But also, as you can see, there is a set of horizontal text, so you have to change the orientation of your reading away from reading Schneemann's text to reading these kind of intersections by Wolf Forstel and oh my god, I've forgotten his name. Something Else Press, man. That's it, Dick Higgins, sorry. Something political about forgetting his name. I'll move on. So, when it comes to actually being published in her artist book, Parts of a Body House book, it's reset again. So this is the third iteration. So this is a shift, I think, also quite crucially between offset lithography to Gestetner mimeography. So the way in which this text is iterated as print is completely different. Beaugest's press works are, the register is totally different, so it kind of has a completely different feel. So you can read this text in various ways. I think when it's reset in this instance, it reads much more as a kind of story rather than a set of instructions. So it's very close. The sections are kind of reduced, but the dates are reinstated. So each section has dates attached to it, showing you the duration that it took her to actually write the text, which spans from 57 to 68. So you can see it here. And then in its fourth iteration, it's essentially a duplicate. So that it gets republished in Beaugest's journal Schmuck, which came out later on in the year. Well, actually, about 2 months later in March 1972. So essentially, they just use duplicates, I think, within this publication. And then its fifth and final iteration in 1972 is in the poetry journal Earthship, which was edited by the poet Chris Hemmensley in Southampton. So again, because he's adopting, and actually has probably maybe a press very similar to Beaugest's, it follows a particular type of typographical logic, especially as essentially the pages are identical sizes, so it's a very different layout to the original in Caterpillar. So why am I talking about this? I found that there's a kind of direct relationship between those early layouts, so Caterpillar in particular, and the instructions that Schneemann made to her performers and the ways in which those texts operate on the page and off the page. So she uses instructions to performers and these type of illustrated scores to incorporate ideas based in her probing forensic observations of herself in relation to others. And these are first explored in the group performance works that she produced during an intensely productive time at the Judson Theatre in the early 1960s. These works, such as Newspaper Event, which I'm showing the instructions from here, were carefully constructed and organised and were broadly invested in an attempt to imagine the material body as both a personal particular environment and as a social environment in conjunction with others. Within this shifting construction termed concretions, Schneemann produced a nervous system of bodies and interaction in which bodily parts could be interchanged. Each performer was attributed an area of the body to inhabit with a set of instructions to interpret. So, for example, I'm just reading out from the instructions here. Engulf someone, something. Lie down to rest. Repeat the above. You can talk about colouring books and crayons you actually remember. Energy compression is your focus, and how you release gesture in space and the spacing between gestures. So this was the instruction number 4, neck, feet, Yvonne Rayner. The types of interaction that occurred within the performative space at Judson is interwoven into the instructional text of Parts of a Body House. Within the site of Schneemann's textual body, corporality is exposed as a network of sinuous circuitry, activated by immediacy, touch, heat, and proximity. So I'm just going to read a little passage from Parts of a Body House. A leap in the dark from an easterly lung, falling briefly, a sudden landing in the heart chamber, Kant's chamber. Enormous, soft, velvety, warm, damp walls, rounded, ridged, pulse gently. Your whole body is squeezed up and down. Between pulses you can clamber around, holding onto the ridges. Each ridge you touch emits an ash of brilliantly coloured light. It is slippery. The muscle walls expand, contract, push you slightly up or down. You may doze in the strange rocking. Only 1 or 2 persons at a time in this chamber. When you wish, begin to crawl down head first, pushing between the contractions. Exit. So you can see there's a kind of relationship between the idea of instruction, embodied description, and documentation. So for Schneemann, this textual body synthesises all that is immediate and excessive, and yet it is not without purpose, for this is a body that is both political and erotic. So I'm including here a piece of work called Sexual Parameters Survey, which is in Parts of a Body House book. So this was first published in the book in 1972, but the duration of the construction of it is from 1969 to 71. And I think it's really interesting because this becomes another kind of conceptualized depiction of intimacy in its very particular form, but extrapolated as conceptual data across a chart. There is another chart within the publication which the reader is invited to actually complete themselves. So there's an idea of interactivity within this publication, but this is more understood as something to be viewed and read. So there's a set of accounts that accompany this piece of work and a set of instructions. So it's through her tracing her daily meetings, her conversations, her recollections, small singularly unremarkable moments that accumulate significance in the indeterminacy of Schneemann's lived life. So there's an account that she gives about meeting a woman called Liz Hiller, who is the wife of Lejarin Hiller, who was a collaborator of John Cage's and a computer sound instructor at the University of Illinois, where Schneemann's partner at the time, James Tenney, was studying. So in the summer of 1960, Schneemann encountered Liz, and Liz gave her a copy of Antonin Artaud's The Theatre and Its Double. So this chance encounter with Liz actually occurred within a week of Schneemann producing her first kinetic theatre environment, which was another situation that was basically random, where a tree in her garden fell down after a tornado and was then occupied by her cat Kitch, who is one of her frequent collaborators. His interaction with this environment then caused her to create an environment for guests who were coming round for a bonfire. she gave them a set of instructions to traverse this fallen tree, which she then observed from an upstairs window and made notes. So this account she actually recalls in several publications. She recalls it in the preface to More Than Meat Joy, and in another text that she wrote for Fluxus Journal in 1972. And I sort of feel like these moments where she pulls out this information speaks very much to this relationship that she has between the everyday occurrences of her life and the ways in which her life is entirely embedded in her own practice. But these kind of conceptualizations, I think, also speak very much to material that we've talked about this morning. So the mise en scène of kinetic theatre constructions, these kind of human and non-human interaction become, from her perspective, multifolate, which is a term that she also evokes quite frequently. So it echoes these ideas that were in circulation that she was reading from Artaud, and it speaks to this subjective synthesis of the senses. So I just took a couple of bad iPhone photos when I was at the show in MoMA, and I just wanted to show you that. So this chart has been extrapolated. So these are the original cut and pastes that Schneemann has then actually turned into an artwork in and of itself. So it exists as a discrete artwork as much as it exists as a multiple within the publication. And I feel like this idea of representing this material is very critical in terms of the reflection that a retrospective might have. And I also feel like I wanted to bring this up because I think it feels very specific to making work at this particular time. So this book Schema by Dan Graham was actually made in the same year, and it was printed in London by Listen Press, and is a collection of his conceptual works to date, and equally speaks to a similar type of conception in terms of the idea of, I guess, kind of extrapolating relationship data as an idea of either multiple choice, but also the fact that he's playing with this idea of typographical layout in particular in terms of questioning, and this idea of interaction being something between audiences. So this idea of rehearsing and distributing ideas through the publication, and through this idea of anthology as well, being something very particular to both of them at the time. And I also feel like I should note that there's quite a few items in this publication that were definitely made in close dialogue with Lee Lozano, of whom Graham was having a relationship just previous to coming to the UK. So in particular the work Detumescence, which is noted in the contents list here. So that, again, this idea of immediacy being a bodily embodiment rather than a kind of dispassionate kind of data set, I think is very much in circulation. These ideas are not necessarily inherent just to Schneemann, that these are things that are being explored by a number of people. And sometimes I think that maybe is overlooked, that these things are kind of messy rather than just dispassionate, I suppose. So within Parts of a Body House book, the seemingly slight alterations in text and setting convey different aspects of either immediacy, as described by the line breaks, to structure and compartmentalised text. The containment of words into short sections serves as a purpose, and when observed against the text as a continuous run, as I said previously, the emphasis shifts. Instead, the presence of the artist's voice becomes descriptive and documentary. So it's possible that these temporal shifts within the text and their different layout formations are corresponding to the propositions foregrounded within Schneemann's group performances. In a description of Thames crawling, which you can see illustrated here, which is subtitled as a Meat Systems event, the resistances and usual hostility of an English audience to physical enactments influenced her plans. She was working with an individual called John Lifton at the time for the space. So she introduced a set of inflatable forms that would enlarge as until they gradually covered the audience. Schneemann had experienced quite a lot of resistance to her work in the UK, including sort of almost physical attack, and so this was essentially the introduction of the inflatables was a way of kind of separating herself from the audience. So with Thames Crawling and the later work, Electronic Activation Room, made for the Happenings and Fluxus exhibition in Cologne in 1970, Schneemann is in effect attempting to produce a type of what I call a fleshy cybernetic environment, similar to that described within Parts of a Body House, with audio and visual circuits that would respond to both movement, position and space, and heat of the spectators' bodies. So here you can see a kind of sketch of a performance that she made in Berlin, which again sort of reflects on these ideas. To her work with John Lifton, who was the founder and director of the New Arts Lab in the UK, and IRAT, which is the Institute for Research in Art and Technology, was very particular to this time and the work that she was making, because he was a kind of electronic specialist. So the New Arts Lab shared space with the London Filmmakers Co-op, of which Schneemann had contact, and some of these performance environments were experimented on at that time. So there's a kind of distinctive mode that defers elements of chance to computing via automating systems that John Lifton was producing with Schneemann at the time. So just to bring it back to the body and to the book, I'll end on this one item. So within Parts of a Body House book, there are a series of original works interspersed throughout the book. And one of these works is called Bloodwork Diary. Well, actually, it's called Bloodwork. It then generates into Bloodwork Diary. So within each of the 60 iterations, so this was an edition, a special edition of 60, within each publication there is a blotting of Carolee Schneemann's menstrual blood. And this work was then a sort of means of her to chart her cycle throughout the 60 editions. So you can only really understand the ebb and flow of the cycle by actually looking at the 60 editions all in one go, which is obviously never happened because the books are now dispersed. But I love the idea of this, the idea of singularity and multiplicity as understood through the single blotting of blood, but it also speaks to the immediacy and touch of the page. So the idea of Schneemann sort of taking these tissue papers and blotting it against her sanitary pads, which is how she produced the blottings in the first place. So I'm just going to read a final part of Parts of a Body House. On the opposite side of the Bar River is a long tract of jungle and forest in which four city blocks are situated. So this is, sorry, I should just say, this is how the actual text ends, as opposed to how it was reproduced in fantastic architecture. On the opposite side of the Bar River is a long tract of jungle and forest in which 4 city blocks are situated, a military installation and a harbour. This complex is called the Gut. In the Gut, people gather to enact various guerrilla exercises in which last form a few hours to a few months. In an open field, they may develop self-defence methods, camouflage marks, disguises, pageantry, non-verbal communications will be set up using fire and light signals, marks and signs made or found in the landscape, and communication by mutual body energy awareness. Special technical effects and certain physical relationships of people and materials will be monitored from the nerve endings room and may be adapted for uses in the gut. So this is just a sort of residual thought as a residue of reading this textual body of Schneemann's. The route through the body house leaves you not in a state of arousal, as found in the reordered version of fantastic architecture, but in the space dedicated to revolutionary discussion, skills training and observation. In such terms underwritten by the notion of the performative school, preparation emerges as a state of making ready, of holding in check something that is never actualised through activation. This space of potential, utopian or otherwise, remains the site in which this text exists. Thanks.